Modern political conflicts don't always happen on television. Sometimes they don't happen at all, in the traditional sense. No shouting matches, no public disputes, no viral moments that get dissected for days. Sometimes the conflict is quieter. It exists in tone, in timing, in the space between what one person is willing to say and what another person carefully avoids. This is about one of those conflicts. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Chuck Schumer serve the same party. They represent the same state. They sit in different chambers, but they operate within the same political structure, and yet the way they approach that structure could not be more different. This isn't about policy disagreements. Those exist, but they're secondary. This is about something deeper, about how you define the purpose of power once you have it. AOC speaks clearly, sometimes bluntly. She names problems directly, even when doing so creates discomfort within her own coalition. She doesn't hedge, she doesn't soften. When she believes something, she says it. Schumer speaks carefully, strategically. He manages expectations. He avoids creating unnecessary friction. When he believes something, he considers when and how to say it, and sometimes whether to say it at all. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but they cannot both be right at the same time. Let's start with language. When AOC talks about power, she talks about using it, about wielding it aggressively on behalf of people who don't have it. She frames politics as a confrontation between those who have power and those who need it redistributed. When Schumer talks about power, he talks about maintaining it, about accumulating it carefully so it can be deployed strategically. He frames politics as a negotiation, where you preserve leverage today so you can use it tomorrow. One sees power as something to spend, the other sees it as something to protect. That difference shows up everywhere. When there's a crisis, economic instability, social unrest, institutional failure, AOC's response is immediate and public. She doesn't wait for consensus. She doesn't coordinate messaging. She reacts based on what she believes the moment requires. Schumer's response is measured. He consults. He calibrates. He considers how a statement today affects negotiations next week. He waits until he's certain his position won't create more problems than it solves. One prioritizes urgency. The other prioritizes control. And here's the thing. Both have been proven right at different times. There are moments when AOC's urgency has forced issues onto the agenda that would have been ignored otherwise. When her willingness to speak without permission has created space for conversations that institutions were avoiding. There are also moments when Schumer's caution has prevented disasters, when his refusal to react impulsively has preserved relationships that allowed legislation to pass later. But those moments don't happen simultaneously, and increasingly the two approaches are colliding. Take how each defines responsibility. For AOC, responsibility means saying what you believe, even if it costs you politically, even if it alienates potential allies, even if it makes governing harder. Because if you don't say what you believe, what's the point of holding office? For Schumer, responsibility means protecting the institution, maintaining the coalition, ensuring that Democrats remain viable in future elections, because if you lose power, you can't govern at all. One believes authenticity is the foundation of trust, the other believes stability is, and when those two values conflict, there's no compromise that satisfies both. This tension plays out constantly, just not publicly. When Democrats face internal disagreements about strategy, AOC will often articulate the progressive position clearly, without equivocation. She'll say what the left wants, why it matters, and why compromising on it is unacceptable. Schumer will acknowledge those concerns, validate them, and then explain why the political reality requires a different approach. He'll cite vote counts, Senate rules, Republican obstruction. He'll emphasize that half a solution is better than none. Both arguments are logical, but they start from fundamentally different premises about what politics is for. For AOC, politics is about advancing values. You fight for what's right, and you accept the consequences. If you lose fighting for something that mattered. For Schumer, politics is about results. You achieve what's possible, even if it's imperfect. If you lose, you've accomplished nothing, regardless of how principled your position was. Neither is lying, neither is betraying their beliefs. They just believe different things about how change happens, and that creates a problem that neither can solve. Because when AOC pushes hard for progressive priorities, she's not just challenging Republicans, she's implicitly challenging the Democratic leadership's strategy of incremental progress. She's suggesting that caution is not wisdom, it's capitulation. When Schumer urges patience and compromise, he's not just being pragmatic, he's implicitly suggesting that urgency without strategy is recklessness, that clarity without coalition building is self-defeating. Neither will say that directly about the other, but the implication is always there. Look at how they handle failure. When a Democratic priority fails, when a bill dies, when negotiations collapse, when Republicans block something, AOC's response is to name who's responsible, to identify which Democrats didn't fight hard enough, which Republicans obstructed, which systems need to be challenged. Schumer's response is to explain why it failed without assigning blame that could fracture the coalition, to preserve relationships that might be needed for the next fight, to emphasize what was accomplished rather than what wasn't. One believes accountability requires naming failure clearly. The other believes survival requires managing disappointment carefully, and both are correct within their own framework, but the frameworks are incompatible. This isn't just philosophical, it has practical consequences. When AOC criticizes Democratic leadership publicly, she strengthens her credibility with progressives. She demonstrates that she's not controlled by the party apparatus, that her positions are genuine, not tactical. But that same criticism weakens Democratic unity. It gives Republicans ammunition. It creates headlines that suggest internal chaos. It makes Schumer's job harder. When Schumer avoids public conflict with progressives, he maintains party cohesion. He projects stability. He keeps internal disagreements from becoming media narratives that damage everyone. But that same avoidance frustrates progressives. It makes them feel unheard. It reinforces the perception that Democratic leadership prioritizes optics over principles. It makes AOC's criticism seem more justified. There's no way to resolve that, because what one needs to be effective undermines what the other needs to be effective. AOC's power comes from her willingness to break with leadership. Schumer's power comes from his ability to keep leadership unified. The more she uses her power, the harder his job becomes. The more he uses his power, the more her position feels necessary. It's a cycle, and it's accelerating. Here's what that looks like in practice. When there's a major vote, AOC will often lay out what she believes the right position is before negotiations even begin. She'll set the progressive standard publicly, forcing leadership to justify any compromise away from it. Schumer prefers to negotiate privately first, to find out what's possible before committing to a position, to avoid boxing himself in with public promises he might not be able to keep. One approach creates pressure, the other avoids it. One forces the conversation, the other manages it, and neither can fully succeed while the other is operating differently. Because when AOC stakes out a progressive position early, she makes it harder for Schumer to negotiate a moderate compromise. Republicans can point to her position and demand that Democrats move even further right to get a deal. But when Schumer negotiates quietly without setting clear progressive boundaries, he makes it easier for Republicans to pull the final deal further right than it needed to be, because there's no public pressure holding the line. So each approach, in isolation, might work, but together, they create strategic confusion. And that confusion has consequences. Democratic voters don't always know what the party stands for, because different Democrats are saying different things, using different language, emphasizing different priorities. AOC will say Democrats need to fight harder for working people. Schumer will say Democrats are fighting as hard as the system allows. Both statements can be true, but they sound like contradictions, and when voters hear contradictions, they start questioning whether anyone actually believes anything, or whether it's all just positioning. That's the cost of this tension, not that one side is wrong. That both sides are creating a narrative problem neither can solve alone. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't going to resolve, because it can't. AOC isn't going to become more cautious. That would undermine everything her political identity is built on. Her base supports her because she doesn't soften her positions. If she started sounding like Schumer, she'd lose what makes her effective. Schumer isn't going to become more confrontational. That would undermine his ability to lead a diverse coalition. His job requires keeping moderates and progressives aligned enough to pass legislation. If he started sounding like AOC, he'd lose the moderates and accomplish nothing. So they're locked in. Two strategies that cannot coexist. Two definitions of success that exclude each other. Two approaches that make each other harder to execute. And the only question is which one the party ultimately prioritizes, because at some point a choice will have to be made. Not explicitly, not with a formal decision, but through accumulated actions and priorities. Either Democrats will embrace urgency and clarity, accepting the risks that come with it, or they'll embrace stability and caution, accepting the limitations that come with that. They can't do both, not indefinitely, and the tension between AOC and Schumer is really about that choice. She represents one future for the party, he represents another, and both futures are plausible, but they're mutually exclusive. What happens when one side treats politics as something to manage, and the other treats it as something to confront? You get exactly this: constant low-grade friction, strategies that undermine each other, a coalition that's perpetually negotiating with itself about what it's trying to accomplish. Some people find that frustrating, others find it necessary, but everyone recognizes it's unsustainable, because eventually either the party moves toward one approach or it fractures trying to contain both. Neither AOC nor Schumer is trying to force that fracture, but they're both making it more likely, not through malice, through consistency. By continuing to be who they are, they make it harder for the other to succeed, and at some point success for one will require the other to step back. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe it won't. Maybe the party can sustain this tension indefinitely, But the longer it continues, the clearer it becomes that these two visions of politics cannot peacefully coexist. One believes clarity is strength, the other believes caution is wisdom. One believes you fight until you win or lose decisively, the other believes you negotiate until you find common ground. One measures success by how much you fought for, the other measures it by how much you achieved, and the space between those positions is growing, not because anyone is changing, because the political environment is forcing choices that reveal how incompatible these approaches really are. So where does this end? It doesn't, not cleanly. It ends with one approach gradually becoming dominant, with one vision of politics slowly crowding out the other, or it ends with a fracture that neither side wanted but both contributed to. Either way, the pretense that these two strategies can coexist indefinitely is becoming harder to maintain, and everyone involved knows it. They just don't know what comes next.